Everyone, I am Barbara Jones-Brown, Director of Signature Books, and I'm joined tonight by Signature's marketing specialist, Beth Brummer-Reeve, who has been doing a fantastic job getting the word out about this event tonight and about the books. Together, we are honored to welcome two very special guests, Laurie Lee Hall and Nathan Kitchen. Yes. Laurie Lee will be speaking to us about her experiences as shared in her memoir, Dictates of Conscience, From Mormon High Priest to My New Life as a Woman, published by Signature Books just a few weeks ago. And Nathan will be speaking to us about his new memoir, The Boughs of Love, Navigating the Queer Latter-day Saint Experience During an Ongoing Restoration, published by our friends at BCC Press. Laurie Lee was raised in New England and trained in architecture at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And incidentally, Laurie Lee, in your memoir, this is the first time you're hearing this, but in your memoir, we have a historical error I discovered. We said that you were the first LDS missionary to leave to go on a mission who had been at Rensselaer. I found out today that Don Carlos Young, Brigham Young's son, went to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, and he served a mission. So
no one remembered him, though.
No one remembered him. But I was always taught in grad school to never say the first or the most, because something will happen and you'll be wrong. So, anyways, just a little.
I was the first in quite a while.
That's right. That's right. As far as we knew until we learned about Don Carlos Young.
Mormon missionary. What's that?
So, anyways, that's just a little bit of historical trivia I had to share. Laurie Lee's career includes managing design and construction programs for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as its chief architect. She simultaneously served in several ecclesiastical leadership capabilities, including as a bishop and stake president, until she was excommunicated by her former counselor in the stake presidency following her transition to live authentically as a woman. Since then, she has served on the executive committee of Affirmation, LGBTQ Mormons, Families, and Friends. In fact, with Nathan served as president, and Laurie Lee served as vice president. In 2023, she became the first transgender recipient of Affirmation's Paul Mortensen Award for Leadership within the LGBTQ Mormon adjacent community. She and her partner, Nancy Beeman, live in Kentucky and have 9 children and 24 grandchildren between the two of them. Nathan served, as I mentioned, as president of Affirmation from 2019 through 2022. Before that, he sat on Affirmation's board of directors and co-founded Fathers in Affirmation, a queer support group for queer fathers. He currently chairs the board for Flourish Therapy, a nonprofit that provides culturally competent and affordable care for LGBTQIA+ individuals, families, and friends. He has spoken at BYU, Utah Valley University, and Eastern Illinois University about the queer Latter-day Saint intersection and how to better support the queer LDS community. A graduate of BYU, Nathan earned his Doctor of Dental Medicine from Southern Illinois University and completed his residency at the University of Iowa. He is in private practice in Mesa, Arizona. He is also a certified suicide prevention trainer. Nathan is a father of 5 children and grandfather of 4. He lives in Gilbert, Arizona, with his husband, Matthew Rivera, who is also with us tonight. So, with no further ado, I will turn the time over to Nathan and Laurie Lee.
Thank you. I was voted to go first.
But I was also able to interrupt anytime I wanted. I didn't tell you that part.
I'm used to that.
Yeah.
I am so thrilled to be sitting with Laurie Lee Hall again. We served almost 4 years together and had some incredible experiences. And as you read my book, I can't help but talk about the experiences I had in affirmation, and they were very unique, very intense at times. And in that book, I can't help but talk about my work with Laurie Lee Hall. So as you read my book, you will get to experience Laurie Lee Hall as I experienced Laurie Lee Hall. I'm not telling her story, but I'm telling the story of us together doing some very incredible things within this very special queer Latter-day Saint space here. So before I begin, I really want to talk a little bit about just some queer spiritual theory before I tie it up with my own personal experience, because it's really foundational for, as you begin to read my book, to see where I am coming from and where queer Latter-day Saints have been coming from for the past 70 years during the history of the modern church. So let's talk a minute about dominant narratives. So, in response to the emerging visibility of LGBTQ identity that the gay liberation movement spurred in the 1950s and 60s, the church joined the entire swath of American Christianity that was confronted at that moment with the need to articulate and develop a theology concerning LGBTQ people that, for most of them, wasn't there or certainly wasn't developed. Now, the theology that emerged in the LDS Church during this ongoing process is underpinned by three pillars. The first is doctrine, the second's dominant narrative, and the third is policy. And within this framework, the doctrine did not change, but instead the dominant narrative was tasked with the heavy lifting to protect the doctrine from queerness, articulating how a queer person fits into the existing doctrine of eternal marriage, gender, and exaltation. And then policies were deployed not only to ensure queer people stayed in their place, but also to control their behavior in conformity with the dominant narrative standard of what defined an acceptable queer in the kingdom. Now, in a 2016 fireside, Richard Bushman introduced the dominant narrative concept concerning church history. He said, for the church to remain strong, it has to reconstruct its narrative. The dominant narrative is not true. It can't be sustained. From his historian's lens, church history did not occur as taught in Sunday school. Now, like church history, the modern church also holds a dominant narrative about queer people. Spoiler alert, which is also not true. Now, this dominant narrative consists of three parts: what the church thinks about queer people, what the church teaches about queer people, and how the church talks to queer people. Now, the dominant narrative defines the queer person's place and identity within the church's theology. It instructs Latter-day Saints how to understand queerness in the concept of God's plan, and it shows Latter-day Saints how to treat and to speak to their queer neighbors and children. It tells queer people what God thinks about them and how to think about themselves. Now, the dominant narrative is constructed from prejudices and misconceptions about queer people. And because of this, like Richard Bushman plainly states about the dominant narrative concerning church history, the dominant narrative in the church about queer people is not true. Our lives and experiences as queer people are not accurately represented over the pulpit, in church publications, proclamations, or conference addresses, or even in church amicus briefs. I firmly believe, like Bushman, for the church to remain strong, it has to reconstruct its narrative about queer people. And unfortunately, I do not have the latitude or the safety of a Bushman when I point out such truths. Now, here's the interesting thing about queer dominant narrative. Because prejudices and misconceptions are sometimes eliminated over time as the children of God learn and grow into the second great commandment, the dominant narrative does not age well over time, and it periodically collapses. Now, these collapses occur when the public, healthcare professionals, parents, church members, and outside organizations no longer tolerate the immorality, harm, and outcomes of the dominant narrative and its accompanying policies, just finding no value in them. Such a failure requires the modern church to then construct a revised dominant narrative with new policies crafted to keep queer exclusion relevant and palatable for as long as possible until the next inevitable collapse. Now, as long as the church feels that it must protect its doctrine from queerness, a dominant narrative about the queer children of God will just exist. Each successive revision of the dominant narrative has the power to press a new generation of queer Latter-day Saints into existence, who are called to navigate waters very differently from their queer elders. This cycle is the arc that queer Latter-day Saints ride as it bends towards equity and justice. So, let's talk about my generation as a sexual minority, because this is how I get into my own queerness. When I was president of Affirmation, a noticeable uptick of queer Latter-day Saint voices, almost exclusively single, openly gay men, had been given access to the official channels of church communications. In these spaces, be it Deseret Book, church magazines and websites, or even conferences, they shared their experiences and wisdom on platforms that would have been unthinkable for queer Latter-day Saints for decades after The Miracle of Forgiveness was published in 1969. I mean, some of these works were sitting on the same shelves that The Miracle of Forgiveness sat on just a few decades ago. So, when we think about it, we know that there's at least two generations of sexual minorities now. We have the Miracle of Forgiveness generation, which was a harsh period of time. And now we have this newest generation who are being celebrated for being single and celibate, and you can do hard things. Well, there's actually a couple of generations sandwiched in between, and I'm one of those sandwiched generations in between. I am one of the last members of the generation of Latter-day Saint young men who was officially taught by way of policy to get married to a woman as a remedy to overcome homosexual inclinations. We were then told to be quiet about it and never tell anyone about our sexual orientation, not even to our wives. So let me end here just by sharing what that looks like for me to be able to rise into authenticity past such an oppressive, dominant narrative of my day. When I was 15, my family moved to Illinois, and it was a culture shock because I grew up in Orem. And this was back in the 70s, and Orem was very sheltered. It was a farming community far from what it is today. I didn't know another non-member. In fact, Orem all of Utah Valley had the most Mormons per square mile than anywhere else in the church. So I thought, we're moving to the mission field, temptation is going to abound. All my friends are going to get me to watch R-rated movies and drink and smoke. But I got there, and soon my own prejudices melted away. The people I feared helped melt them away. I was 15, and this is when you begin to mature. And I'm as a young man in Illinois, and I have a crush on my best friend in high school. And he just was everything. I admired him greatly. And I wanted to figure out, what does this mean? What is this growing up process? And so I did what I always did. You go and you consult the prophets and apostles. They were my trusted advisors. So I go on my parents' bookshelf, and I go and I see this great book by Spencer W. Kimball, The Miracle of Forgiveness. This looks interesting. He's the only prophet I knew. And so I pulled it off, and by the time I got to the chapter, Crimes Against Nature, I am a 15-year-old boy just sweating on my parents' couch. My face is red and hot, and I believed, because I was told that I was a filthy homosexual. And just because I was that, my very belonging in my family, in the church that I loved, was in jeopardy and in danger. I told my friend, I can't even be friends with you anymore. I have to cut off all contact. I sat with this for a year. until I finally decided I was going to go see my bishop, because I was sure he could remove my homosexuality from me because he was the bishop. And so I did the bravest thing I had ever done in my life, and I made an appointment with my bishop, and I met with him. And as I sat in his office trembling, confessing how I felt about boys, he stopped me mid-sentence and he says, "I don't want to hear anymore." He said, "What you need to do now is just be obedient to the commandments. You go on a mission, you get married to a woman, but whatever you do, don't tell anyone about your sexuality, your homosexuality. It's just very shameful." And as we stood to leave, he put his arm around me and he said, "I am not going to tell your parents about our visit tonight, because it would be such a disappointment to such faithful parents as yours." And so I left as an Orthodox teen, knowing that the bishop speaks for God. I had my marching orders. I knew exactly what to do so that I could enjoy belonging in both my family and the church that I loved, both here on earth and for eternity. And the message broadcast to me is what I had was extremely shameful. It would hurt anyone who knew about it. And I was a generation that we were just hidden. We were hidden from all of you. There are hundreds of men just like me who were your bishops. We were in your stake presidencies. We taught your young men. We taught your gospel doctrine classes. We gave you temple recommends. And then as time went on, our insides began to decay, because what we had to do is dissect ourselves in two, continually dissect ourselves in two, ignore our sexual orientation. And that is very harmful when you ignore that part of you. And I'm now in my mid-40s, and I'm like, I don't understand why I'm falling apart. I'm living every straight Mormon man's dream, and I am falling apart. I want to die, and that's not a normal thought that one should have. When this was happening, Prop 8 was happening, and so the world was not safe. But I realized that once I realized and gave myself the courtesy to think perhaps I'm gay, I needed to share that with people closest to me, because I was no longer living the life plan of a 17-year-old given to him by a bishop. I mean, this was the life of my wife and my children. They did not know that they were in a mixed orientation marriage or family. And so authenticity and truth is always the best option. And as soon as I knew about me, we had a discussion. I'm sitting on the bed with my wife, and as I told her, it was just as if I had murdered the very man that she thought that she knew, which I did. And it completely unmoored the both of us. It marked the end of my straight identity in our marriage. And for a good 2.5 years, we talked about, can this marriage continue or should it continue? And the short story of a long story, which is in the book, is my marriage did not survive my second coming out. In fact, my whole life fell apart, and I was falling into loss. My children were falling into loss. And it took a good decade for me to climb out from underneath the dominant narrative of my day, only to see what the church had in store for me, because they had left that dominant narrative. New dominant narratives were in store, and now I was to be captured again under the newest dominant narrative, told to be single and celibate for the rest of my life. And here I had just experienced the institution of marriage, realized that's a healthy way for me to be, and I can't wait to finally be able to marry according to how my heart opens to love. And the church was trying to capture me again in a dominant narrative that I knew was not true, because all the dominant narratives the church has is built on prejudice and misconceptions. And I already gave my life over for 20 years to a dominant narrative that failed me, and I was not going to let that happen again. And my stake presidents began visiting my home, checking on me. Are you married yet, Brother Kitchen? Checking my finger for a ring. And by the time I had met Matthew, dated, we were a month out from marrying. My stake president came to my home, looked me in the eye, and said, "I invite you not to marry." And that is when a spiritual experience to me. I mean, I knew that my choices in choosing love, no matter the spiritual violence of what would occur to me if that happened, was the way forward. That was the way forward into authenticity. And I chose authenticity. And unfortunately, I chose it because I had a lot of experience of what happens when you don't live authentically, and I was not going to do that again. So the moment that was the happiest day in my life, I get a summons for a church court. And I look at that Post-it note that's stuck on my door from the UPS with certified letter from my stake president, and I ripped it off, and I, just like Job, I said, I am fed up. I am fed up with unjust power here. And how that all played out, you'll need to read my book. Because it's really great. So let me just end by saying how I reflect on this moment. I know that in this game of a power center like the church trying to capture its queer population into a dominant narrative, in this game of prejudice, no one is the winner. Absolutely no one. For me, that was the moment that prejudice won. And prejudice was going to win because my stake president was struggling to excommunicate me. Prejudice is so pernicious that it wounds everything that it touches. The target, those who wield its power, and the society that tolerates its presence. If Zion is truly built on equality and justice, then prejudice is that antithetical force that just rots Zion to its basest form. Building Zion is a collective venture. We cannot approach Zion in isolation. Rooting out prejudice from our hearts begins when we call out to our neighbor and authentically tell them that we want you with us, to be a part of us, that you belong with us. And I was reminded of the maxim that true belonging doesn't require you to change who you are. It requires you to be who you are. In the face of spiritual violence, I acknowledge the power structure that I was in, the power that I had lost, and the power that I was reclaiming, which was my agency, my voice, and my sense of control in this situation. Importantly, I symbolically claimed something in the face of power that I already innately knew was mine but had not yet owned. My own narrative. For the first time in my life, in that period of time, I let go of the dominant narrative and fully embraced mine. And that has been the biggest, most healing blessing in my life. Thank you.
So we just sat for record 18 minutes that I've ever been this close to a microphone and didn't make a sound.
I know. I was waiting.
As I have read my copy of Nathan's amazing book, of all the great stories in there, and I participated and lived in many of them, and I've heard most of them be told before they wound up between these covers, his last sentence about throwing off the dominant narrative that bound him and claiming and owning his own narrative, to me was the most powerful line in the whole book. It's on page 188.
288. Note, this is a very rare time that I get to jump in here.
Good heavens, he's right. 288.
Don't look so surprised.
Anyway, it's the one page I dog-eared. 288. Shows what happens when I try to be specific. And I suggested to Nathan and I counseled together about what we would do together tonight in this tag team experience. I suggested to him that was powerful. The way he analyzed the dominant narratives of the church's power struggle through its history, to, as you put so well, to control the queers and protect their doctrine. And then that powerful concept of claiming one's own narrative. And for good or evil, we have all lived much of our lives probably enslaved to certain dominant narratives. And to piggyback on what Nathan has taught so well, and I wanted him to share that with you because he's done such a great analysis of it, I wanted to share with you from Dictates of Conscience how I wrestled with the dominant narratives that had control of my life and the processes that occurred that I allude to, that I talk about in the book, of how I was able to claim my own narrative. And I think it's not oversimplification or hyperbole to say that the self-determination process, the self-acceptance process, maybe even the coming out process, has everything to do with identifying and claiming your own narrative. In Dictates of Conscience, I weave my growing up experience as a closeted whatever I was, because there were no words to explain it. My going off to architectural school, my joining the church and committing to never think about being a girl again, and taking this whole Latter-day Saint priesthood path into heart and to go be the very best version of that I could possibly be. And then I reaped all the benefits of that priesthood privilege, that whole world. And I talk in the middle chapters a lot about my work at church headquarters and share a number of stories that may be interesting to some. And in the chapter From Ashes to Authenticity, I start describing a parallel experience I had with regard to the Provo Tabernacle that had burned and was gutted, and our assignment to turn it into a temple. And I want to share from that point. On June 26, 2011, I was in the midst of a week off at home when I received a phone call from presiding Bishop David Burton. "The First Presidency is pleased with your report regarding the Provo Tabernacle," he told me. "They have a special request, which you must keep confidential, engaging only the smallest number of your staff possible. They want you to return and report if the tabernacle remains can be rebuilt into a temple." "Absolutely," was my response. I hung up the phone, awash with awe. I was sitting at my bedroom desk, a solid maple table. My grandparents used to provide breakfast to their bed and breakfast cottage guests on the coast of Maine in the 1950s and 60s. As I contemplated this new assignment, thoughts flooded my mind, as they often did when challenged with a new project. This time was different, however. I was sitting at my desk, dressed as Laurie, when I took the phone call. Marlene, my spouse, and our younger daughter Tatiana were visiting our oldest son Isaac and his family in Idaho. I had taken advantage of the empty house, perhaps for the first time during daylight hours, to dress or present as Laurie as part of my effort to find my true self. At that point, I was still unsure if I was sinning by wearing women's clothing and making myself up this way. I feared I was cutting myself off from the companionship of the Holy Spirit, but I was about to discover that was not the case. I envisioned the layout of the rooms on 3 floors of the building. Through the tabernacle, though the tabernacle had a 2-story facade, its interior had only been 1 level, with a mezzanine balcony. I thought how the temple's support areas, like dressing rooms and mechanical systems, could work, as well as how the temple patrons would symbolically and physically move through the temple. At the same time, I also committed to the principle that there would be no visible building additions to the original historic form of the tabernacle. Like our design plans for the renovated Salt Lake Tabernacle, I produced quick sketches describing the 3 levels of the new temple. We would excavate several levels below the former main floor, with additional underground spaces created beneath the park adjacent to the tabernacle. In less than a couple of hours, the layout was clear and ready to develop. I determined the handful of people I would trust to show these sketches to, who would develop the design into a full presentation to church's leadership. I did all this while sitting at my grandparents' table as Laurie. The paradigm shift at that little table was the self-acceptance of my female gender identity, even though it conflicted with my physical biology. I did not understand then, as I do now, the affirming experience it was for me to create the design of such a unique project while being my authentic self. Doing so stripped away decades of guilt and shame regarding my identity and finding my authentic self-expression. I found the confidence to move forward with my investigation of truth. As I sat and designed this new repurposed temple, I was redesigning and repurposing myself. I find it hard to describe how this experience changed me. Over the next 5 years, as circumstances at work and church compelled me to continue to present myself as male, I knew inside that I was female. Knowledge I once possessed as a child and a teen, but suppressed for so long. My anger, anxiety, and frustration, which I was working to overcome, were directly related to my denial of my true self. Finding and never burying again my gender identity was the key. Further down, I described what I just described was the kind of intellectual and logical understanding of and self-acceptance of who I was, because I'd been so accustomed to working in my professional work for the church, following the Spirit, that to know that I could do that while presenting as myself and feel that same Spirit helped me to overcome the shame that I felt that maybe I was sinning and never thinking that that's really who I was. But then I explain the other side of the coin, which was my spiritual affirmation with regard to my identity. A month following the dramatic announcement of the Provo City Center Temple, I was on an overnight flight from Salt Lake City to Lisbon, Portugal. Unable to sleep on airplanes, I used the time in the dimly lit quiet to record my thoughts on my smartphone. I documented the case I made for myself that I was transgender. By the time I arrived in Lisbon, I had prepared something of a personal treatise. Our team separated and went to our hotel rooms to rest before we began our next several days of documenting architectural precedent to guide our design of the future Lisbon temple. Once in my room alone, as I frequently had over the past several months, I used the time to dress and make myself up as Laurie. Just like when I was a teen, doing this brought an enormous sense of relief and a wholeness of self. I lay on the bed rereading my journal from the flight coming over, reinforcing to myself that, right or wrong, I was genuinely transgender. For several months, my personal experiences and study continued to eliminate the guilt and shame of this admission, yet I was still unsure of where God was regarding the issue. Having guided all aspects of my personal and family life, pastoral service, and project work for the church using personal prayer and revelation, I was confident I could learn God's mind concerning me if I but asked. For the first time in my life, I knelt while still presenting as Laurie, unsure of what response I would receive. As I prayed, "Dear Heavenly Father, this is me. This is Laurie Lee. This is who I am. I have studied a lot about what it means to be transgender, and I identify as female." I was amazed by the response. A peaceful assurance and sensation of joy revealed to me that I had finally come to accept myself as deity had always known me to be, just as God had created me to be. I sat and pondered this answer for a long while. I now had knowledge and assurance that my gender, my eternal spiritual identity, was not only acceptable to God, but was previously known by God. And that mattered enough, that heaven felt joy over me catching up to this knowledge. Understanding this cemented my truth. I had, after 50 years, finally accepted myself as God knew me. The thought brought joy, which penetrated deep within me. My real work of change began, but my true identity still lay deep under the rubble of choices and trappings of my adult life, of attempting to present as male, contrary to my nature. I could go on, but in the interest of time, within a few months of that experience in Lisbon, leaders of the church at the highest levels learned that I was transgender, that I believed myself to be transgender, and I found myself in a lot of general authority interviews on this subject. And I'll just mention that having had those personal, individual, and personal revelatory experiences gave me the strength to be able to look them in the eyes and testify to them that I knew, that God knew who I was, and that I was on the right track for me personally, to which they all disagreed. But I was beginning to claim my narrative, and it required really the sacrifice of everything that I had been to become the person who was going to follow the narrative that I had discovered. I went so far in those general authority interviews and exchanges of letters and so forth, which are all contained in here, the most important parts of every word they wrote to me and I wrote back to them are in the book, which makes for a fascinating appendix. But at one point, I wrote and told the presiding bishop of the church, this was in August of 2013, that I intended to fully transition and live as a woman. And when I saw that letter again after 10 years, I thought, wow, that was a courageous thing to do. I'd actually been that clear. And that was all about claiming my narrative. That was about saying, this is where I'm going. It took some time, and it required an enormous amount of courage and change. But it was the knowledge that I was living by the light that I had received, not the information or lack of information that others above me had available on the subject.
Well, I think the two of you sitting here tonight are giants. So please join me in thanking Laurie Lee and Nathan.